Of any journey that the longer it lasts, the more it palls. If so, it is especially true of journeys undertaken in the company of fellow travellers in whose selection you played no part. We begin with the highest of hopes and the best of intentions. And that was the case that day at the close of August 1957, when Malaya was declaring an independence whose inauguration I would arrive too late to observe. We assembled in the crowded bus lanes of Victoria Coach Station, where coaches were departing from Margate, Brighton and Bournemouth. We hunted among their serried ranks for one announcing its destination as Bombay. Having traversed the distance to Calcutta on the initial journey, Paddy Garrow-Fisher had decided to switch to Bombay for this second trip. The coach we found, painted a khaki shade of yellow, was if anything smaller than the ones bound for various seaside resorts within 4 hours driving distance, and it was conspicuously older, considerably so, clearly designed to serve those same English spas in an earlier era. Other than removal of the last row of seats to allow greater space for storage of baggage, tents and cooking utensils, it appeared to have undergone no special adaptation in preparation for a journey designed to last some 8,000 miles, as opposed to 80. Day trippers boarding their luxury clippers on all sides of us looked quizzically upon a vintage vehicle, calling itself the Indiaman, and blatantly substantiating that appellation with a map of the route stretching the entire length of each side. One or two came over to inquire where we bought the tickets and how long the trip would last. We told them quite truthfully that we hadn't been provided with tickets or any specific dates, but we hoped the journey would not last longer than 6 weeks. Paddy Garrow-Fisher arrived to take charge. In addition to running the company business at a long distance, with his secretary back at the London office to hold the fort, he was going to be our sole driver and guide for the entire route. With him was his diminutive Indian wife, Moti, who took her place cross-legged on an enormous bedroll at the front of the bus beside her husband. She was responsible for producing the right maps relating to every sector of the journey. Made territorial claims that would survive the entire distance. I sat in the last surviving row, immediately in front of the improvised baggage compartment. Alongside me was a sandy-haired young man my age, who diffidently introduced himself as Nigel Service. I was to find as we progressed that I had made a fortunate choice of travelling companion. Nigel and I established a friendship which would outlive the journey. At Dover, we boarded a ferry that headed into appalling seas. I survived the open decks longer than most, peering through my camera's viewfinder at a scene suddenly obscured by the descent of a giant wave that submerged me entirely. I had to dry out the camera, whose condition concerned me more than the state of my clothing. But since it was also necessary for me to get to my suitcase, I set out to accomplish both objectives at the back end of the bus, in the dark and deserted bowels of the ferry. This presented greater difficulties than I anticipated. The pitching and yawing threw me around to the point where I couldn't keep my distance, or balance, leave alone change my trousers. In the midst of trying to perform this task, I was so overcome by nausea that I abandoned the bus, one foot caught in a trouser leg and the other out, hopping over to the bilges to throw up. The whole miserable ordeal was accomplished by further such interruptions until I feared I would pass out. I found the entire complement of passengers and a large part of the crew laid low by the ferocity of the seas we were taking on board. I made my way to the purser's desk, where I had been advised to get my passport stamped. A hand materialized over the counter, groping for the stamp with which to affix the necessary entry. I guided hand and stamp to the first empty page in my almost virginal passport. I learned later it was one of the worst crossings in living memory. It was soon apparent that this would be no guided tour of interesting landmarks encountered en route. No explanations were forthcoming other than those obtainable from fellow passengers who had the foresight to arm themselves with guidebooks. Paddy's objective was to cover the distance from A to B as fast as possible. We had a long way to go, and he knew conditions would deteriorate steadily the further we progressed. The good roads were where he planned to make the best times. I wished I had prepared myself by reading more about the geography of Europe, but neither geography in general nor Europe in particular had figured high on my reading. Wrong turn towards the Swiss rather than the Italian border. Once we'd sorted that out, we headed for Turin and Milan, where we paused for a visit to the cathedral and then pressed on to a campsite by the shores of Lake Como. There were many of us who had looked forward to Como with its old town, basilica and Piazza Cavour, but no, time wasn't going to permit, so on we sailed, out of Lombardy and into Veneto. Here we demanded and were granted time to linger over Shakespeare's Italy. The view has been expressed that Shakespeare must have been Italian, because no less than 15 of his plays have Italian settings. If so, he would have been an Italian very poorly informed of his own country, because in The Tempest, Prospero tells his daughter how they were put aboard a small boat at the gates of Milan and borne out to sea. In The Taming of the Shrew, we hear of people coming ashore at Padua, while in Two Gentlemen of Verona, Banzino warns Launce that he will lose the tide if he tarries any longer. Nevertheless, Italian or not, the plays were the thing, and to see those inland cities where they were set did not disappoint in any way. For all on board the good ship Indiaman, the crowning glory of Shakespeare country was to be the city where the bard did get his tide tables right, glorious Venice.